Hi, I'm Barney Cokeliss. I'm the writer-director of Night Dancing, and I'm here to talk to Fan Carpet about the film.
So you're still seeing her?
Now it's different. There's a man.
I've been a really avid audience member of contemporary dance for quite a long time without ever really knowing why. It's not something that I necessarily even think I understand particularly well, but I've always been fascinated by it. So I've seen a lot of dance. I always go to Sadler's Wells, and that kind of boundary between physical theatre and straight dance is something I find quite interesting, and the amount of narrative that either is or isn't in a piece of dance fascinates me. So I've just always been intrigued by it, and it's one of the elements that fed into the film that, without me even really having to think too hard about it, just was one of my fascinations. And I suppose if I try and analyse why I like it, I suppose it's that combination of emotional content, music, movement. There's obviously light. It's a whole kind of aesthetic experience that is just that bit different from, I suppose, seeing a narrative play where people are talking instead of moving. But fundamentally, it's all the same elements that fascinate me with film. So the film was shot in Bucharest for one really great reason, which is that we could afford to make it there. I happened to be out there shooting a TV commercial just before we shot Night Dancing, and I was able to keep some of my key crew on. And then all of the hard costs of making the film, which I did have to pay, are just that much cheaper there. I've worked there quite a lot. I must have maybe done about 20, 25 commercial shoots in Bucharest. So I'm actually as familiar with the crew and the setup out there as I am anywhere, really. I work as regularly with Romanian crew as I do with British or Canadian or German crew, and they're great. So one of the things you can really see in the film is the quality of the art direction that they have there. And Andrea Gergel, who's our lovely Romanian production designer, built that entire street in the studio. So the whole film is shot in the studio, which I think really helps giving it a kind of a unity and a sort of a consistent aesthetic. Because if you're out in the street for real, there's always changes of weather and light and time of day and wind, and you just always have that slightly. It can be wonderful for a different kind of project, but for something like this, it would have been that little bit less precise. So the question about mental health is an interesting one, because I was thinking just before the premiere at TIFF in Toronto, I was thinking, well, what do I say to introduce this film? And I thought, well, a lot of people had responded to it as this wonderful sort of vision of hope and taking a leap of faith and belief. And actually I felt like saying, well, it's kind of a snapshot of mental illness, really. I mean, there's a lot in the film that's terribly sad, and 25% of the Western world at any one time is suffering from some sort of mental illness or another. And I didn't want to make it feel like a kind of public service announcement about mental illness, but it is about that. And so the question about what you can and can't rely on being real, I think, is really interesting, because of course we all live in the version of reality that our brains provide us, and how does that connect with what's really out there? And funnily enough, I actually began the process thinking about a different condition that could make people see things that aren't there. I was fascinated to read about something called Charles Bonnet syndrome, which afflicts some people who are losing their sight, and as the quantity and quality, I suppose, of visual information that their retinas are providing their brains deteriorates, their brains start to fill in the gaps. And so you hear people with Charles Bonnet syndrome there's one woman who was looking out of her window watching the monkeys play on her neighbour's roof, but she was in Sweden, and there aren't any monkeys on the roof in Sweden. And another woman saw an enormous face every time she turned out the light at night. As soon as there was darkness, a huge dark face would appear floating in the bed above her. And these are people, Oliver Sacks writes about them, I think. They're people who often think they're going nuts, and they're not, they've just got a physiological thing. And so that was something I was kicking around with for a while, and then it occurred to me that actually, when you've got, in a sense, that little summary I've just given you sort of gives you maybe the narrative limitation of that issue, because there's a simple physical explanation, and once you're told, you're kind of off the hook. And so I thought, maybe it's more interesting to pick a subject where it's much more emotionally driven and psychologically driven rather than just a physical issue. And so for me, that question of what you can rely on as being real is something that at some level we all have to deal with probably every hour of every day. You know, am I seeing things accurately? Am I overreacting? Am I underreacting? Have I lost my brain? Someone very famous, whose name I've now forgotten, said, I think it was George Orwell, said, seeing what's in front of your nose requires a constant effort of will. So I suppose at the more extreme end of a psychological disturbance, that can become a perceptual thing where you're actually seeing stuff that isn't there. But I like to think that it's an issue that we all can at least empathise with, and unfortunately quite a lot of people have to then deal with some way or other. Right, so you raise a really interesting question about the perspective on the dance scenes, because in the story, the dance is always being seen by the main character played by Jason Thorpe, but actually the camera isn't always in the more extended dance scenes in those positions. And that was something I did quite consciously, because the correct thing to do would have always been to be watching from his perspective, but then we wouldn't have been able to really get the most out of the wonderful dance that was being performed. And so I like that fact that we cheat a bit. There's actually quite early on, I think it's probably about the third shot of the dance, it's from behind Louise as she's dancing as a car goes by. And I mean, that's for no reason other than just because it looked great and was atmospheric and the light moved interestingly. And it's completely wrong if you were teaching a sort of class on film grammar. So I guess the whole film in a way is inside the Jason Thorpe character's head. And so I felt that I could take a bit of poetic license and put the camera wherever it felt most kind of evocative. And then in terms of how we actually did it, just logistically, because we only had one day to shoot the film. It's a very long day, but it's only all done in one day. And the main way that we got through that with the dance was having two cameras. So Philippe Kress, the wonderful Danish cinematographer, would operate one camera and I would operate the other. And on the whole, I would be handheld and I'd be sort of running around the set finding all those little odd angles, like where they're heavily loaded to one side of frame or another, or they're quite asymmetrical, or we're kind of parked behind a lamppost or whatever. And Philippe would be making sure that we got all the beautiful coverage that included the dance in its entirety. Because one of the things about dance is that on the whole, it's best when you can see the whole figure. You know, when it's cut up, in a way you're sort of doing the audience's work for them and telling them where to look. So I was quite conscious that we needed to stay back enough to really appreciate what Louise and Jacob were doing, but also to get in amongst it enough to make it an interesting bit of film. So there's one moment when she's really close up and she's lying back and her face comes in and out of focus. And that was so hard just for the focus puller to keep sharp at that moment. We must have done that 15, 20 times, just that little bit. And I love that fact that when it's one of my favourite bits of the dance footage in the film really is that moment where she's lying back. It looks really effortless. She looks completely kind of like sort of abandoned really, and yet we've got a gang of Romanian film crew desperately struggling to make sure that her eyes are in focus at just the right moment. So I'm very lucky with the collaborators that I've had on this film and in fact in general, and I have a little gang that I like to use on every project. I can't always get exactly the same people every time, so I have a sort of little stable of maybe 5 or 6 favourite cinematographers, a couple of great composers that I work with, wonderful editor or 3, and on this one I really had my absolute dream team. Barney Cokeliss, the wonderful Finnish composer who wrote all of that music completely from scratch and for this film, she was writing that and perfecting it while we were editing. So where often in film the editor and the director might finish their work and then hand it over to the composer who then has to fit the music around the images, we were able to make our images respond to her music as much as the other way around. And that was really wonderful. It was amazing hearing that come to life when Anne had the real players come and play, because you start out with a synthesized score and then there's real strings, and then really just, we thought it was great, and then it just got to a whole other level once it's played, organically with that human quality. So she's really, I suppose, a co-author of the film, really, because the music is so powerfully contributing to the emotional impact. You know, I can't imagine the film with other music. You know, and then Marco Perez is a fantastic Italian editor who lives in the States, and I got to feel very glamorous and important going to cut my short film in New York, which felt much more glam than it should have been, doing a no-budget short film, but it felt very cool. And Marco's great. He's a real artist. He's a real intellectual. He's a wonderful friend and a wonderful editor. And so he and his company, who are called Union Editorial in New York and Los Angeles, they were really helpful. And then Philippe Cress is the cinematographer. What I love about Philippe, and it's interesting when you ask what I look for, because cinematographers like Philippe are very busy, and sometimes I can get him and sometimes I can't. So I do look at other people's work from time to time. And I can tell very quickly whether I believe the lighting, whether it gives me both a kind of atmospheric and an aesthetic impact, and at the same time doesn't look like lighting where I can feel where the stands are and where the lamps are, and it all feels a bit kind of fake. So it's that sort of combination of an authenticity but a really strong visual look that I really look for. It's an interesting question about gender in the film, because I didn't make a conscious thought about which gender any of the characters would be, funnily enough. And you can imagine that story, you know, it could be about a gay desire, it could be about female to male desire, it could be about all kinds of things. There could have been a big age disparity, a bigger one. I mean, there was a bit of one, but there could have been a massive one, or it could have been reversed. So it wasn't conscious, but the way that the film came to me was as an image, and I'm hoping this can be my trick in future, which is that rather than sit down and go, right, what shall I write about, what shall I make, and what would be a smart next move, forget all of that and just think, well, what's coming to the surface of my imagination without me making any effort at all, what's just coming. And what happened to come to my imagination was a woman dancing on her own in the street, and you don't know why she's there, and I guess as it develops you don't know whether she's really there. So she was a woman actually just from the get-go, because that's just the image that pops into my head. And I can completely imagine, you know, I can imagine a younger psychiatrist, a female. I couldn't imagine a psychiatrist who was the same gender and age as the woman, because, or as the dancer, let's say, if we imagine a parallel world where the gender roles are different. Because of that thing that Hitchcock said, who actually talking about women, but he said, and I think it's true, he wasn't really thinking about racial variation at this point, but he said if you have 3 women in a film, you need a blonde, a brunette and a redhead. And I think in a short film it's even more true that the audience's ability to get confused between characters can never be underestimated. You know, it's sometimes it's amazing how confusing things can be if you're not careful. So I needed differences so that you could quickly know who was who and not be confused, especially given that I was playing a little bit with who was who and putting Louise into the psychiatrist's chair for a bit. But there wasn't a conscious agenda to say we're going to have a mysterious, aloof, powerful woman and a sort of desperate man. But it's certainly something that you can think about afterwards. I suppose for me, the fundamental thing about the film is it's subjective as much as it can be. I mean, it's from the perspective of Jason's character, and so all of the other characters really only exist in the way that he perceives them. We don't know what actual life and internal life Louise might have, what her relationship with Jacob, who she dances with, is. We don't know what's going on with the psychiatrist. So I'd say fundamentally, it's the perspective of the central character that determines how the other characters come across, and in this case, of course, she's this mysterious and enigmatic object of fascination for him. In terms of what I'm looking for when I'm starting the process with a blank piece of paper, it really is a feeling or an atmosphere that I have in my head that I want to bring to the screen. I've been working for quite a while on an adaptation of a short story by J.G. Ballard. And the reason that I've stuck with it, even though it's a hard one to adapt, is that there's just a really particular atmosphere in my mind about how that could be translated to film that comes even before particular plot elements or twists or characters or relationships. So I suppose the fundamental thing that I look for is this: is there a door opening to a world that I can go and enter and then find the story in and find the subject matter in? And I've read a couple of books about screenwriting, and one of them, I think I was relieved to read, said something like, you realise what your film is about, after you've written it, or while you're, finishing writing it. Let's say you shouldn't start from a premise of what do I want to say. I think what you want to say as a person will be something you want to say anyway. Talking to people or listening to people, and in your work. And I liked personally to just let my instinct lead me to what I find fascinating. So one of the films I'm attached to at the moment as a feature film is in fact an animation, which isn't something I ever had a particular idea that I would go into, but it suits that particular story particularly well. So I'm fascinated about that. And then another one is quite a sort of dark science fiction thing. And there's really not much similarity between the two, other than there's this emotional hook where, for me, it's all a bit pointless if you don't engage and move the audience. And you can do that in a number of different ways. But I suppose that's, if I'm thinking consciously, I'm just thinking, is this going to communicate with people and involve them? It's been great how well it's been received so far, and in terms of what a little film like that can do in the world, I suppose, we have to be realistic, it's just a short film, but at the same time it's been to a lot of festivals. It's about to be shown in flight on Air France, which is quite fun, with French subtitles, so that's very arty. I just like it to be seen by as many people as possible. I would love it to be picked up and shown by any broadcaster that wants to show it, just purely because more people see it that way.
Yeah. How do I know if he's real?
Thank you for watching The Fan Carpet. If you like this video, be sure to click that thumbs up button at the bottom of your screen. And also be sure to subscribe to the Fan Carpet YouTube channels. They're absolutely free and so much fun too. Be sure to check out the official website, thefancarpet.com. Also, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to stay up to date with reviews, competitions, the latest news, and so much more.